So let's get started, and we could jump in. So thank you all for jumping in for Make Compliance Easy with DevOps. I'm Bradley Stein, and we also have Quentin Hartman here. And so I'm thankful for y'all to come and participate with us. So this is a discussion. We've got people monitoring the chats. So anytime you have questions or want to throw something out, feel free to send it in through the chat, and we'll answer the questions as they come. So Quentin, why don't you give yourself a quick bio, tell everybody about you and what your background is.
Sure thing. In addition to what's on the screen, I started Heartcraft Technology Services a little over a year ago, and I'm focusing on consulting in the DevOps space, particularly with SDLC, fractional CTO, that kind of stuff. And I've been having some good fun with it. I particularly love using DevOps to uh, help people just enjoy their jobs more, avoid the drudgery. And I find that that's particularly powerful and useful in the compliance space. In my life as a full-time employee, compliance was always kind of a dirty word and a dreaded activity. And I spent a lot of time working on it. And I found that uh, taking compliance considerations into the design of the rest of the DevOps stack made my life a lot easier. And so I'd like to help other people do that.
Awesome. And I'm Bradley Stein, so co-founder of Sempersec, and I've been doing this for a long time. So I do the dirty work, right? So I do the compliance and help organizations try to integrate the two, right? And so it's always, um, you know, not I want to say a battle, but it's a battle between bolt-on security, bolt-on compliance versus being part of the solution, where we can truly get some efficiencies and automations and so yeah, it should be a good conversation, and I'm excited to get into it. So we've got four main topics that we want to talk about here. Technical architecture overview, right? So going back, starting with the part that Quentin was talking about with making sure that compliance is part of that architecture, putting it in the beginning and not at the end. Why does that matter? Stuff like that, right? Some compliance tips, right? So some stuff that I've seen going through working with various organizations, small to large. DevOps best practices, right? So when we're talking about DevOps and compliance and how do we do this together, right? And what are some of those things that we found that works best? And then lastly, we'll talk about some infrastructure needs to knows, right? So basically going through and how your infrastructure is laid out will determine some of these compliance options or capabilities that you have to your exposure. So cool. So let's jump into it. With your technical architecture review, right? What Quentin, what do you see or what have you seen as being important when it comes to this topic?
Well, I think there are a couple things that are important. One of the big things is making sure that when you and this is true whether or not you're designing for DevOps, is making sure that you build compliance considerations into your process, right? And so you have checkpoints and you have places where um, the where it's easy to create what I call handholds for compliance to be baked into the process. So like if you're an ISO shop, for example, there are places where you can actually create automations where you can let the computer do the things you say you're doing in your ISO policies, um, rather than having to layer that in later or force someone to do it by hand or just say, so and so has to do this at that time, right? And so I think that's a really important part. And then making sure that that actually does get built into the automation. I think one of the places where a lot of organizations fall down and is that when it comes to automation and when it comes to sort of DevOps adoption, they sort of stop at the MVP, right? And I think that that's a big part of the reason why the wrong the incorrect notion that DevOps is sort of antithetical to compliance has stuck around for so long. You know, way back when DevOps was new, everybody was like, "Oh, DevOps is just you do what you want to do and you don't follow the rules and all that sort of nonsense," which is absolutely not true. But I think that notion has had legs because people stop at sort of the MVP of their DevOps adoption and their automation adoption. And so once they get to the point that they can deploy code with automation, they just don't go any further, either because of resource constraints or time constraints, or whatever the reason is. They don't go all the way to sort of cover the corner cases, or cover the exceptions, or cover the full suite of requirements that they actually have. And as a result, things end up still needing to be done by hand frequently, right? And so what they really need to do is spend the time to really fully do that adoption. And then that supports that compliance activity, because they can bake those considerations into the automation, because they've actually gone through the process and actually done that work up front, that makes it so that they don't have to do that work on the back end.
For sure. And talk to me a little bit about going past that MVP, right? So,
Hmm.
if we start using linters or
Hmm.
enforcing their policies, maybe it fails a build. Is that a problem, right?
Hmm.
For a lot of people, that's a big concern.
Hmm.
And so, having those gates. So walk me through some
Sure.
of those advanced portions, or, going past that MVP to make this work.
Yeah, yeah. So like one of the things that I see all the time is that somebody builds a CI/CD pipeline and they build in a test step, and during the initial part of the adoption, they turn off enforcement on the test. So like the test can fail, but it doesn't fail the build, right? Well, turns out they never actually make the investment to make it so that those tests pass. And so they never turn on enforcement on the test step, right? So
Yep.
so if you go through their history in their CI/CD pipeline, those tests have never once passed, right? But they have also never failed a build as a result, because they've never turned on enforcement, right?
Right.
You can see similar things with the linters. Um, that it's that kind of pattern that you'll see frequently. The other thing that you'll see is that like uh deployments to the dev environment are all automated, but the deployments to the production environment aren't, right? um, because everybody's afraid to let the machine do the work when it comes to production, right? That part has to be done by hand. And and in some cases there's legitimate additional complexity, right? And but that tells me that you need to move some of that complexity, at least proxies for that complexity, into the dev environment, so that way you can build faith in your automation that it's actually going to do the right thing. Or you need to build checkpoints into your automation, so that way you can build some comfort into it, so that way you can at least have somebody who's sitting there pushing the button, so that it's partially automated, so that it's not that it's not someone doing the process by hand. It is someone pushing the button so that the automation can continue, right? So that way you are creating those artifacts in the system that the automation creates, so that way you have those compliance artifacts later, when it comes to audit time.
Well, when you brought up compliance artifacts, what are
Hmm.
some of the things that you can do to automate that artifact creation or
Hmm.
collection for those deployments?
Well, like a really big one is integrating your version control system to your CI/CD system and things like that. Like a really common control is to require pull requests, right?
Mhm.
And so if you tie your let's say Jira, your work system to your version control system and your CI/CD automation system so that you can see that um, this ticket, this story is tied to this branch on the repo, which is tied to this pull request, which is tied to this CI/CD action because they all reference to each other. They're all linked together. That shows that this work, which was authorized, was executed in this branch, which was then reviewed in this pull request by this other person and was deemed to be okay, which complies with the policy that you have that says that the work has to be checked by another person before it can be deployed. And it was deployed as part of that action. And so all of that can be done by integrating those systems, and it happens automatically if you train your developers to go in and push the buttons that says create a branch and execute the action, or it happens automatically when they check in the code and they create the pull request and all that sort of stuff. All of that stuff can be created by integrating those systems together and really making it low friction. Um, and that allows that linkage to be created automatically. So when it comes to compliance time, you don't have to worry about pulling out particular samples and things like that. You can just have your auditors just look at any pull request and say, okay, here's a pull request. It's pointing to that work which was authorized because that work was made into a sprint, and it goes to the and it was and that work was reviewed by that third party, and you can see that they said that it looked okay to them, and then it was deployed as part of that action, and all of those pointers to process are in place, and nobody had to do any extra work to make it happen.
I like it. I like it. So let's move past the initial MVP, right? So let's say we
Mhm,
do have something in place.
mhm,
What type of things from an architecture perspective, maybe what type of signals
mhm.
or standardization should we be putting into this environment so that way we can continuously monitor that the environment is in fact what we expect it to be.
Yeah, so there are a few ways that you can do that. A really useful thing to do is to make it so that your CI/CD system will emit a deploy event into whatever monitoring system that you're using. If you're doing observability, you're probably using something like Datadog or CloudWatch or Dynatrace or Grafana, something like that. All of those tools have the ability for you to create custom events, right? And so as part of your deploy automation, you can create a custom event that is a deploy event, and that deploy event can have a payload with it that has a version number or has a git hash, or and whatever information is useful for your organization that allows you to trace that deploy to a particular state of code, right? That's really kind of the name of the game with all of this stuff, is creating that traceability so that there's never a question of what is happening, why it's happening, any of that kind of stuff, right? And so again, this is kind of going beyond the MVP, right? You've got something that works. Now you need to add that little bit of extra feature that you may not do initially, that then adds that extra layer of traceability into the system so that somebody can look at a dashboard and say, oh, look, there was a deploy. And oh, look, it was version XYZ. And then they can go into the system and see that version XYZ had these changes associated with it, and so on and so forth.
No, for sure. And one of the things that I would add to that is the standardization of those, of those events, right? And so,
Mhm,
working through with multiple customers, right? Everybody's events are a little bit different, right? And how are they hashed and they standardized, and especially in different environments,
Mhm.
your events and what they look like may look different, right? And
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
creating that governance model around your events or your signals, that something has
Mhm.
happened is important, especially around incident response.
Mhm.
To be able to identify, yes, this person or this process kicked off and made those changes, and here's,
Right.
all of the ancillary things. So that's something that I see that gets skipped quite often because it's like we'll just create it, and everybody has their own sort of flavor of how they want to create those signals.
Mhm.
So making sure you put in that governance signal somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's super important. And I think it's also important to realize that, like, particularly for a small organization, or an organization that's really kind of working on maturing and getting their feet under them, what is right for the big organization that some of your staff may have worked at previously may not be right for you, right? Um, let's just use semantic versioning. Everybody's familiar with the 1.2.3 versioning system,
mhm.
right? In order to use that effectively inside your automation pipeline, that can be an awful lot of work, right? To have all that stuff get automatically bumped and managed and all that sort of stuff. But really look hard at the value that semantic versioning brings to your organization and how you're using it. And if it's not actually bringing value, just using a Git hash may do what you need it to do. And you don't have to do any manual management of that at all. And so, really looking at the signals that you want to get out of a system and really asking yourself what value they bring may allow you to eliminate some things that some additional work that you think you need to do, that but ultimately you may not.
That's a great point. Now, from an audit purpose,
Hmm.
what about extracting your data or those signals, right? So
Hmm.
obviously, I need to show evidence that things are happening. Maybe it's showing a deployment that corresponds to a change request that corresponded to a vulnerability that was identified, right?
Hmm.
So let's talk about disaggregating your data and some of the challenges there.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think when you're, depending on your system and how big it is, I think one of the challenges one of the things that people don't think about on the front end is making sure that when they put their signals into their log aggregation system, that there's sufficient information associated with it that they can actually disaggregate it later, and they can say with confidence that yes, this log message came from that specific system on, on this specific day on this specific run, right? And frequently the information is there in the form of like a GUID, or something else that some other system tagged onto there. But depending on how sophisticated the tooling you're using is, it may be frankly kind of a pain to run down exactly what it's actually pointing at. And so that can be a good lever to justify the spend on getting some more sophisticated tooling. Or if you don't, or if that's not an option, maybe it's just as simple as adding a little bit of extra telemetry to your existing signals that's real explicit. That is, this came from service XYZ on server ABC, right? It's one of those things where, yeah, strictly speaking, maybe you shouldn't have to do it. But if there's a shortcoming in your tooling, if there's a shortcoming in your tooling elsewhere, but it makes your life easier, it might be worth doing, right? So just make sure that you take the realities of your environment into account. And sometimes there are certain things that it may feel like you shouldn't need to do it, but it might make your life easier, and it might be worth doing, until you can justify the more sophisticated tooling that will make your life easier in the long run.
Absolutely. And once you get into a state where you start having multiple frameworks, right?
Hmm.
Um, Using compliance as a code, right, is important from an automation perspective.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of companies coming out and they're creating APIs or they're creating this or that to start pulling data from an environment, pulling logs from, a data lake or
Hmm.
whatever repository you have. And so making sure that your signals are able to be pulled out, extracted, and reviewed, right, is going to be important in order for those automation checks to
Hmm.
to work, right? So because
Hmm.
what I'm seeing right now is that you're seeing uh, engineers are having to go in and they're pulling extracts of logs, they're pulling screenshots of logs. It's a very messy capability. Whereas, with automation, right, you can do a validation. Did this ever fail? Right. And all of
Hmm.
a sudden your evidence turns into, instead of showing every time something has happened, right, here's my failures. Here's the
Hmm.
validation that we did, right, every time that this process was supposed to happen. So I
Hmm.
think that that's something that's super important, that as you're developing this, and especially if you're going to be in an industry or your organization is going to have multiple frameworks that you're going to have to pull, with multiple audits, maybe your
Hmm.
customer audits, who knows what, why you're going to need to pull that data, right?
Hmm.
You're going to need able to pull that data and be able to pull that data in a way that's not going to impact or compromise another customer, right? And you need to be
Yeah.
able to be able to handle that. So,
Yeah, yeah, and I think that really goes back to sort of the technical architecture considerations, right? Every system that is going to be in use in any of these platforms is going to create and emit signals, and managing that can be a huge headache, right? And some of them are play real nicely, they're real open, and they're like, hey, yeah, sure, we'll share our data, you can get it, it's no big deal. And some of them frankly don't, right?
right.
And so that's a really important technical consideration for tool selection that I think is frequently missed. Um, and and so that particularly with some of them where like it's real easy to get the data as an event. So as things are happening, you can get the data real easily, but then to go back and get data later is really difficult, right? And so that goes into that completion of adoption thing, because in order to have that tool be really truly completely adopted, you need to be capturing those signals as they're emitted and putting them into a data lake or putting them into some other data store, so that way you can access them later and you can do sort of that compliance as code activity, because the tool that you're generating that signal with, whatever it may be, may not allow you to do that easily later. And so you can't really consider that tool fully adopted until you can say confidently, yes, I can do the reporting that I need to with the data that it creates.
Nice. I like that. So when we're talking about, architecture and some of the things, one of the things that I see that people struggle with sometimes is secrets management. You
Hmm.
know, what are some advice that you have that for
Hmm.
secrets management? Where do we store it? How do we not hard code credentials
Sure.
into a script, right?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that the biggest challenge with secrets management is that it's real easy to go overboard, right? Um, Secrets management is one of those problems that, like, it can be really hard if you want your secrets management to be able to handle every single possible corner case, right?
Yep.
Um, but it also can be relatively simple and relatively straightforward, right? Almost every platform and almost every sophisticated tool out there that you're likely to be using, um, AWS, Azure, GitHub, GitLab, Heroku, everybody has some kind of secrets management tool baked into it, right? And most of them are cheap or free to use. And it's really just about embracing what you have and using it and getting value out of it. And once you reach the raggedy edges where it's no longer meeting your needs, then moving on to something else, right? It's a classic case of letting perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Um, you know, um, uh, ha- Feeling like when you're getting started, you have to run this like fully fault tolerant, highly available Vault deployment that is really, really complicated. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Vault. I think it's a really, really powerful tool, but it's also overkill for a huge number of people who are running it. And that's a big barrier to entry. I mean, even something as simple uh as encrypted files. I mean, there's a tool that the name of it escapes me at the moment right now, that is a secrets management tool that is designed for organizations that are using GitOps, and it does this really nice creative encryption of secrets values inside JSON blobs, and it's really, really lightweight, and it's really, really elegant. And it's a super simple, straightforward way to integrate secrets management into a CI/CD pipeline without any sort of dependency on a third-party service, right? Stuff like that exists. So secrets management doesn't have to be hard, and so there's like no excuse at this state in 2024 for having secrets in code. There's just no excuse anymore.
For sure. Now, when you're talking about leveraging secrets, is there
Hmm.
an minimum viable product from a secrets perspective? Like, so if you were putting in an environment or looking at an environment, what
Hmm.
would be that minimum bar that you would be looking at and helping organizations to at least get to?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really think it is that kind of what I described is that using your platform's available tooling to store your secrets in one place, or at least the fewest places possible, and just starting there, just like, okay, this is you're using what is already available to you, and you don't have secrets exposed, right? So cool. That's you have done the minimum required, right? Then you can start talking about, okay, do we want to do things like auto rotation? Do we want to do things like auto expiration? Do we want to do things like a central repository that gets checked in and checked out? Do we want to do things where like a human can check out a secret and use it to do elevated access and that kind of stuff? That starts getting into sort of that next level, right?
Yep,
Where it's a more sophisticated use case, and where more sophisticated tooling is called for. And so that th- but that is the piece that I think not necessarily every single organization needs, but a lot of them may. And so that's where you start getting into sort of that beyond MVP space.
for sure. And then from a compliance perspective, right? I'm
Hmm.
seeing a lot of, they want to see you be storing them, right? Where are you storing them? Are you
Hmm.
protecting them?
Hmm.
Right. And we'll go into our back there about who's got access to them. And you kind
Hmm.
of went and touched that with the check in, check out. But the
Hmm.
other part is from a baseline is you should be able to rotate them
Sure.
or change them. Right. And
Sure.
so a lot of organizations don't test that
Mm.
functionality or
Hmm.
that process, right? And so
Hmm.
when a secret's about to expire, right, it's a big deal, right?
Right.
Because they've never
Right.
rotated it and tested what's the application going to do or what's the
Hmm.
environment going to do, how's it going to handle it. And
Hmm.
so making sure that you've tested that process of rotating a secret, you
Hmm.
know do it before something is expired, so that way it's not broken
Hmm.
100%. You can
Hmm.
always rope back, but at the end of
Yep.
the day, make sure that you're testing that process, because that is something that is, it doesn't matter your framework, but it is something that you're expected to be able to do.
Yeah.
um, and
Yeah. And that's
auditors.
yeah, and that's another fine point that I think is another one of those there's no excuse in 2024 sort of things is having your secrets be relatively narrowly scoped, right? So that way, if a secret does expire, or like the rotation goes sideways or something like that, the blast radius of that failure is pretty small, right? Because we do have, even at the most basic level, we have really good secrets management tools available to us. um having having really narrowly scoped secrets is really low effort. So there's absolutely no reason to have like one secret that gets used in a whole bunch of different places. There's no reason for that. That would be another sort of MVP consideration, is that you really need to have a whole bunch of narrowly scoped secrets in order to keep that blast radius down.
Nice. I like that. I like that. So let's jump over to some configuration management, right? So
Hmm.
as we're talking about, compliance, for all of the other frameworks, right? There's a
Hmm.
security baseline, there's configuration management, change management, you name
Hmm.
the terminology, right? There's some sort of flavor with it within a compliance framework.
Hmm.
So what are the things that you look for, some of the things that you'll implement to help with configuration management, with helping the compliance team, or
Hmm.
offloading some of the tedious manual processes on an
Hmm.
engineering team?
Yeah, so I mean the biggest way to do that is just automation, 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 right? We were actually just having I was just having a discussion about this with some of my DevOps buddies, and talking about how how do you get folks who are used to making changes through a console to do it through code, right? And doing it through the automation. You can go through and reduce friction and add templates and make it as easy as possible to put it into code. And sometimes the only answer, even after you go through the training and they still want to do it through the console, and even after you add all the helpers and add all the support and they still do it through the console, sometimes the only answer is you just have to turn off the console access, right? Sometimes you just have to make it impossible to do it by hand. um and that's just is the reality is that people are going to default to whatever's comfortable, right? and and until folks get comfortable doing things in code, um that's just how it's going to happen, right? I am a big fan of treating any change as code, right? And you handle it through the same change management processes that you would handle any other code change. So it goes into a code repository, it gets reviewed, it has a pull request, and then it gets deployed, right? I think that's really the cleanest and most ideal way to do it. um in some cases that literally is impossible, depending on the platform you're using. There are some changes that you cannot do in code, right? And in those cases, you can still work the process through your ticketing system and through sort of that supporting system. I've had cases where um, basically you created a story, you took a screenshot of the before in the console, and then you executed the change and you took a screenshot of the after, and then you had someone else come in and validate and take another screenshot and validate the after and do that kind of thing. And sometimes you just have to do that, right? um but that is happily becoming more and more rare, as platforms mature and as API first becomes more and more common. Again, I would expect that the only times that you would need to do stuff like that in 2024 is if you're working with some sort of a legacy product. um Anything that has been developed anytime recently, I would expect that you would be able to make those changes in code of some kind, and you'd be able to um, use your SDLC change management process to manage those changes.
For sure. And the more you drive that changes code, right?
Mhm.
Um, allows you to audit and to validate that you're not deviating from your security baseline, right?
Mhm.
And so,
Yep.
one of the things I was thinking about earlier was, having a good security baseline,
Hmm.
which most organizations I would say they get a C on it, right? It's
Mhm.
very high level. It's not very prescriptive, right? But
Right.
if you have that security baseline and, you're having changes and the
Hmm.
changes don't impact your security baseline,
Hmm.
right? That can reduce the need for security or compliance being part of that change review process, right?
Yep.
So you can start creating efficiencies with engineering
Hmm.
teams, right?
Hmm.
That, through your normal change process, right?
Hmm.
If it's not deviating from that security baseline that you've developed, and again, this is going past that MVP, right?
Hmm.
But getting past that perspective, all of a sudden, security doesn't need to be involved. They don't need to be a
Right.
roadblock, right? You guys are going through it. You're working through playing within the guardrails. That's
Hmm.
what I like to call it,
Yep.
and it makes things a little bit more efficient and stuff like
Hmm.
that. And then you can bring security in when there's an exception that needs to be done. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm actually a big fan for organizations that are in the cloud, and that's pretty much all organizations at this point. I really like this cloud security posture management tools, CSPM tools, that can automatically scan your cloud environments for compliance with various security frameworks, right? Um, I find those to be really, really useful to, like, to see if uh your deployment is compliant with, like, the AWS well architected recommendations, right? Or to see if your deployment is compliant with the NIST recommendations, that kind of thing. Just having that report to see where you are compliant and where you're not compliant, and in those places where you're not compliant, see, okay, is this a risk I actually care about? Is this something that applies to us? Um, yeah, I think is really, really powerful, right? Because that uncovers a lot of things that maybe you hadn't thought about, maybe you hadn't really considered. And having that visibility automatically arrive in a report, in your email, on whatever cadence you want, I think is really powerful.
right.
And seeing how that changes over time, you can build a program around driving that number down. And um I think also that shows that change, right? That I think that sends a powerful signal to auditors that you
Right.
are committed to improvement, right? You know, we can have a report that says 12 months ago we had 1,400 findings, and today we have 800 findings, right? It's not perfect, but we've improved a whole bunch, and I think that
Yep.
that's a powerful signal to send to auditors.
So how do you, and I'm gonna ask this question because this is something that I hear from my clients quite often,
Hmm.
right? So we run a tool like that, right? And all of a
Hmm.
sudden we have a bunch of things we need to do.
Hmm.
How do I communicate to the engineering teams
Hmm.
to get some of these things on out of the backlog, right?
Mm.
We could
Hmm.
create tickets, we could create all these things, we could have conversations, but at the end of the
Sure.
day, right? There's a prioritization, right? And so, compliance, security, we always throw things over. We're not
Sure.
always in that conversation. So is there
Right.
something that we can do to better articulate or improve that relationship so that we can see some of the progress that you're just talking about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, fundamentally, it's a culture thing, right? And I know that that's kind of a answer, right? But sadly, it's the truth, right? When it comes to working on the things that I can never remember what they're called, but there's that four square quadrant of things that are important or urgent,
Yep.
that kind of thing. And those sorts of things tend to land squarely in the important but not urgent but in
Right.
quadrant, right? And so and that kind of stuff frequently just doesn't happen, right? Regardless of whether or not it's security. There are a million different flavors of tech debt, and I'm gonna throw that into the bucket of tech debt. There are a
Right.
million flavors of tech debt that tend to fall into that quadrant that just don't get resolved. They just sit there and rot for an extended period of time. And it takes a culture shift to get that stuff addressed. And to a certain degree that takes some amount of top down prioritization. To a certain degree, a team can just can just put their foot down and say no if the surrounding culture will support them on it, and say no, we're not going to spend all of our time working on this feature stuff. Having this tech debt hanging over our head makes our lives worse, makes our stress levels higher, makes everything harder. We are going to allocate 10%, 20% of our velocity every sprint to working on this stuff to try to chip away at it, right? And I've found that is a that kind of of approach tends to be the most sustainable and tends to be the one that is easiest to get buy-in from leadership, is something along the lines of assuming they're doing agile and assuming that they're sprint based, is something along the lines of, we're going to spend 60% of our sprint on feature work, we're going to spend 20% of our work on tech debt, and we're going to spend 10% of our work on research, and we're going to leave 10% of our sprint for overages, right? You know, something like that, where it is recognized that that's something that needs to be done. I think is important, and I think getting that buy-in from leadership to address that kind of stuff is important, is a good approach. Another approach is not bucketing it with tech debt, right? And calling it out as a security concern or calling it out as a compliance concern, because frequently you'll have somebody in the C-suite who's really, really banging the gong about GRC, right? And if you can tie that work to GRC, then all of a sudden it becomes a priority, right? And and so then that can be really helpful. The other approach that I find has worked in the past is running what we call a squash, right? You know, every once in a while is like, you know, maybe once a quarter, once a month, spending like a whole week dedicated to a squash. Like this week is a bug squash. This week is a security squash. This week is a cloud security posture squash, right? And you know, and you kind of treat it like a hackathon, where it's like, okay, we're going to be totally heads down, and we're going to just work on this one problem and get as much done as we can. We're going to throw normal process out the window, and we're going to um play some stupid games, and we're gonna bring in pizzas, and we're gonna watch movies, and we're gonna try to have some fun while we knock out this normally boring, tedious nonsense that nobody wants to do. And we're gonna try to make it fun, right? And that's an approach that I've seen have some success on a few different occasions, because it breaks up the monotony, right? And it's kind of the opposite of approach of making it normal. And so again, depending on the organization, that may be really effective. That they have these periodic squashes where they go through that and kind of make a carnival of it, right?
Right.
And it lets them chip away at that class of work.
Oh, for sure. You know, and I think the biggest thing that Quentin's saying here is you need a partner, right? You need
Hmm.
to partner with the teams, right? And again, if you've got a champion from the C level, right, leverage that. I've never seen it work where security or compliance is coming in with a big stick. I can guarantee it will not work out. It will not go
Hmm.
as you think it will. Um, Functionality and customer requests, even though they may not be urgent, will always take priority.
Yep.
So it's just what it
Yep.
is.
Yep.
So.
Yeah.
Awesome. So talking about, working with the various teams, another thing that I hear is, my code's infrastructure, right? It's a deployment code. Why do I
Hmm.
need to scan it?
Hmm.
How do you handle a conversation like that?
Yeah, I think the best way to handle that is to just simply say, well, that means that your code underpins everything else. And so if there's a problem there, everything that relies on it is also going to have a problem, you
Cool.
know? And I think that, I've found that kind of cuts most arguments off at the knees.
I like it. I like it. Are there, do you have to go buy expensive tools to do infrastructure scanning or code scanning? Do
Um,
I need to go buy a new tool?
sure.
what type of thing can you use?
That kind of depends on who you ask, right? There are a lot of open source tools out there that do this kind of scanning, and you can ask one person and they're going to say, oh, those tools are terrible, you should never ever use them, right? And you can ask
Right.
somebody else and you can say, and they'll say, oh, those tools are really good, you'll get a lot of value, right? um I think it's telling that oh goodness, who was it that recently open sourced a bunch of their baseline scanning tools? One of the big commercial scanning companies recently open sourced a whole bunch of their baseline stuff. uh well, anyway, um, uh, I personally am of the opinion that let's say the open source tools are bad. Let's start with that assumption that the open source tools are not nearly as good as the commercial tools. Are the open source tools worse than nothing? Probably not, right? And so I would say at the very least, um, having going with the open source tools, implementing the open source tools into your pipeline and getting started there at least lets you build up the muscle, right? And I think that that's one of the most important parts with all of this stuff, is with all of this compliance and security stuff, is building the muscle memory and getting in the habit, right? Being in the habit is the most important part, in my opinion, of having all of this stuff being successful. Making it normal, making it just how you work. And getting those open source tools into your portfolio helps you learn, helps you baseline things, helps you get into that habit. And even if they're not the cream of the crop, even if they aren't the flagship, even if they miss some stuff, they're also going to catch some stuff, and you're going to be better off than you were yesterday for using them.
I agree. It's one of those things that you can't let well, I can't afford this tool, right? So we're not going to do anything, right?
Right.
I've heard that many times that, if you
Hmm.
can't get, what's in the magic quadrant or whatever's, you know,
Hmm.
something is better than
Yeah.
nothing. And like
Yeah.
you said, it gives you the reps so that you
Hmm.
learn how to do it.
Yep.
Because a lot of times for an immature organization, if they go
Hmm.
and let's say they have funding, so they go purchase that tool, right? That cream
Hmm.
of the crop, and they don't have the reps, that
Hmm.
tool may never get implemented correctly, right?
Oh,
They
absolutely.
may never actually use the full
Absolutely.
features or as expected. So,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I talked to a client last year about implementing a really sophisticated observability tool, and they had nothing. And I had a real candid conversation with the manager, and I was like, going through this tool evaluation at this point is not going to be money well spent. You at right now, you guys need to start with the free stuff, get and figure out what you actually need, figure out why the free stuff doesn't work for you, and then do the evaluation on the big boys, right? Because right now, you don't even know what questions to ask to do the evaluation. All of these tools are going to look the same to you at this point, right?
yep.
And so yeah, so it's and I think that that with that that kind of thing can be the same in the security space. Pick the cheapest tool and get started. And frequently the cheapest tool is free, right?
Right.
And then once you find the places where that tool doesn't meet your needs, then you have the knowledge to pick a better tool, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's like what is what the one of my favorite questions when we're talking about like it's kind of an interview question is like, what do you hate about this tool, right? And like if somebody can't tell you what they hate about a tool, they're not actually using
I like it. That's a good
it.
catch. Awesome. Well, we've hit a bunch of different topics, and I want to be cognizant of the time. So,
Mhm.
Quentin, is there anything that you want to call out before we start wrapping things up?
The only thing that really comes to mind is just that, there's this myth that DevOps practices are kind of antithetical to compliance, and that just couldn't be further from the truth, right? Doing DevOps well and doing it the way it's meant to be done it absolutely is supportive and synergistic to compliance and security and those sorts of best practices. And so absolutely don't let anyone get away with using that as an excuse for not doing DevOps.
Well, and I'll add to that, right? So I can
Mhm,
speak on the security compliance side.
mhm.
We, the security and compliance, need to learn more about DevOps and understand, right? So, for example, a script that DevOps does from a baseline that we know runs and creates that security baseline or can be your evidence, right? We have to get better. We have to understand what's being implemented. And when we start understanding at that point, I think that the communication disconnect between DevOps being scary and people just running code and doing things, right? All of a sudden doesn't become scary, right? Because there's an understanding of, hey, there's these services they deploy, the secrets aren't there, right? They're managed appropriately. We can rotate them if we need to, if somebody leaves, right? Or vice versa. Um, you know, we should be working together and getting better at understanding, what people like you do, and how we can work together and make both of our lives better.
Yep, for sure.
So awesome. Rachel, I see you jumped back in here. Do we have any open questions or anything we want to do for the last couple minutes before we call it?
I haven't seen anybody raise a question, but I was gonna just offer if anybody had any questions to go ahead and either write in the, you can write them in the chat or in the Q&A section.
Well, while we're waiting, Quentin, how do people get a hold of you? So if they have questions about DevOps, or let's say we've got an organization that is, trying to get
Sure.
their hands around it, how do people get a hold of you?
Sure. I am Q Hartman, Hartman on most social platforms. Or if you just want to email me, I am Q at Hartcraft, HARTKRAFT.com.
Awesome. Well, awesome. Thank you all for your time, and I appreciate everybody joining.
All right. Thank you.